Hi, everybody. Welcome to History Cambridge's History Cafe, Changing Tides in Cambridge Industry. My name is Marika Van Dam. I'm the Executive Director here at History Cambridge. I have light skin, brownish shoulder-length hair, and a dark shirt, and I'm sitting in front of a bookcase. Now, you may be wondering why I'm saying all that, but the reason is that it is best practice for folks with low vision. So we're trying to make what we do, everything here, accessible. So thanks for joining us tonight. Now, it may be a surprise to see me here and to see Beth as our speaker. Unfortunately, our speaker for the evening, Dr. Andrew Robichaux, was unable to make it at the very last minute. And but I am very pleased tonight to have in his place our very own Beth Folsom. She will be talking about the topic here tonight. Before we get started, I definitely want to say a big thank you to Mass Humanities. Mass Humanities has sponsored this event and many other events for us over the many years, and I couldn't be more grateful for everything they do for us and everyone else in the Commonwealth. So if you don't follow Mass Humanities, go to their Facebook page. They have a great page. You can get a lot of information about what they do and all their exciting opportunities, and it's wonderful. So please support them, and thank you to them. I also want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional homelands of the Massachusetts people, people who are alive and well and thriving today in the Commonwealth. The Hooperly Nichols House and all of Cambridge is Massachusetts land, unceded territories. And I'd be curious if anybody wanted to share in the chat where the traditional homelands that they are calling in from. If anybody has any extra special accessibility needs tonight, just let us know. You can drop us a note in the chat. And again, for folks who are just joining us, please put who you are, where you're calling from in the chat box, and let us know what you are interested in about tonight's talk. We are fascinated here at History Cambridge about workers and what workers do and who they are and how it's changed over time. In fact, we devoted our whole year to who are Cambridge workers, answering that question. And so I'm really excited tonight to talk with our very own Beth Folsom about what that is and what it means, especially what it means to her. So you've probably seen Beth before. She's been our program manager for over 2 years now. And but allow me to formally introduce her to you. Beth, she's a native of Framingham, Massachusetts. It's where she grew up and where she still lives. She has 2 wonderful children. She went to Wellesley for her undergrad and did her graduate studies at American down in DC. Her historical jams are cemeteries. So if you ever want to go to a cemetery, call up Beth. It's totally her jam. And she loves memorials and monuments, which she's also talked about in the past with History Cambridge, but fascinating to learn more about with her. So I guess without further ado, I'm going to toss it over to Beth. Now, Beth, tonight's talk was Changing Tides in Cambridge Industry. What do you mean by tides? What do you mean by industry?
Okay. Great questions. Thank you so much, Marika, and thank you all for being here. I'm thrilled to be discussing this topic with you all. The way that I'm going to frame it, because I know there's so much rich material for us to talk about that we can't possibly get to it all tonight, but I'm just going to lay out a few kind of a little bit of a framework, because there is so much that we could delve into. The way that I am framing this, and the way that Dr. Robichaux was going to be discussing this as well, is we know from our last History Cafe that people have been doing hard, arduous, backbreaking, unglamorous, and sometimes, not so difficult and glamorous work as well, from the beginnings of indigenous settlement in the area, and then of course British colonization. But what we mean by industry is, in particular, things that are produced or accomplished on a larger scale, mostly things that are meant to be sold away from the Cambridge area, so on a larger scale than what people need to live and thrive in the family or small community setting. So making stuff for the market. So our time frame here is really from the 1830s, 40s is where we're going to start our discussion up to the present day. But most of what we're going to talk about takes place from the mid 1800s through the mid 1900s. That's the bulk of our topics for tonight. So, and what do we when we say Cambridge? So there's a lot of places in the greater Boston area and a lot of places across the country and around the world that make similar things. These are products or industries that that are pretty well known in Cambridge, and I'm actually curious to know if folks want to drop in the chat what you think of when I say Cambridge industry. What are some of the goods or services that you think of right away?
That's such a great question. I was over dinner tonight. I was telling my daughter, who's 4.5, that I was going to be doing a talk, and we were going to be talking. Beth was going to be talking and teaching us all about Cambridge industry. And did you know stuff was made in Cambridge? She's like, it was. And so I told her a few of the things, and she was pretty excited. I was like, you know, we made glass here. And she's like, glass, like plates? And I was like, yeah, we did all that. And she was pretty impressed. So yeah, quick poll, quick pop quiz. If anybody wants to type in something, we'll see if Beth is going to talk about it.
I have picked a selection, and I know there's, as I said, a lot more to talk about, but oh, yep, munitions, definitely. Rubber, printing, ice, Polaroid. Oh, excellent. Candy, glass, and soap. Yes.
That's like the top three, right? Right.
The
there.
top
Boom,
three.
boom.
And bricks, of course. Oh, wonderful, William. I can't wait to hear some of your stories if you care to share. Your grandparents from Lithuania. Foundry, shoes, car parts. Yes, absolutely. All of these. The main industries that I'm going to talk about tonight, I'm going to touch on a little bit about glassmaking, which was early, one of the earlier industries. And then I'm going to talk about brick making and the clay pits, and talk about soap, candy, and then we're going to touch a little bit on the tech sector and food and the restaurant industry, because we're really talking in this program about not just the industries that Cambridge was home to, and some of them are, it's still home to, but who are the workers, and particularly what groups of people, what demographic groups, ethnic or racial groups ended up kind of concentrated in different industries, and why that happened, and how that changed over time, how the demographic makeup of different industries changed over time, and what other factors accounted for that. So that's what we really want to focus on, and I thought those were some good examples that we can trace that line through. Slaughterhouses, yeah, porterhouse steaks. Y'all are making me hungry. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start with candy, actually, because it's even though I said glass was an old one, the roots of candy and the candy making industry in and around Cambridge, and really across the United States, has its roots very deep in the 17th and 18th centuries. So I'm curious to know, you can put up your hand or type in the chat, whatever you feel most comfortable doing. Does anyone know why Cambridge is such a center of candy making and what its ties are to an earlier period of history? So candy making starts in the late 1700s. We'll go through all of that, but the century and a half before that, there's something very deep in the roots of Cambridge that and the North in general, as well as the South, that ties to and leads up to candy being a major industry in Cambridge. Does anyone know? You can take a guess. No judgments. Sugar cane coming from the Caribbean. Gold star from Arnie. Thank you. Yes. So Cambridge is a center of learning, a center of progress, a center of really cutting edge worldviews in many ways, but it's also a city that was founded on the profits of the slave plantations of the Caribbean. So when you look at, for instance, the Hooper Lee Nichols house or other houses on what we now call Tory Row, you see these amazing, beautiful mansions and manicured gardens and lawns and everything. And it's gorgeous and it costs a lot of money. And so where's that money coming from? Well, folks here are, doing a decent business for themselves in the 18th century, say, but their real money is coming from the Caribbean. And many of the homeowners on Brattle Street also own other properties, more agricultural, larger properties outside of Cambridge. And then they also own or run or manage slave plantations. So they are enslaving people and making their money and building Cambridge on the backs of enslaved workers on these sugar plantations. And that's particularly true of Cambridge landowners having plantations in Jamaica and Antigua. Those are the two big islands that have connections to Cambridge. So, so that's where the money's coming from. That's also where things like endowments for universities and different schools at different colleges, churches, public lands and public institutions, the profits of enslavement are everywhere in Cambridge. And that's certainly not unique to our city, but it is something that we don't think about as much in the North, and especially in a place with such a progressive reputation and such an abolitionist reputation as Cambridge, that these two things were coexisting. Yes, it was a center of abolitionist activity. It was also a center of profits of enslavement. Yes, so we have a steady supply of sugar and molasses coming from the Caribbean to the Cambridge area and Boston as well, as much as we don't like to lump them together. So the candy industry in the Cambridge area actually starts in Boston. The first major candy factory was built in 1765 on the Naponzit River in Dorchester by an Irish immigrant named John Hannon. He builds a chocolate mill powered by the water on the river, the Napontet River. But it's not until the 1840s and the introduction of the steam engine that we see a boom in the candy industry, and many candy companies then move from Boston. They move and expand, and new companies start up in Cambridge because land was cheaper at that point than it was in Boston. And so it was a more lucrative place to set up shop. By 1946, so we have a century later, there were 66 different candy companies listed in the Cambridge City Directory. So that's quite a lot. We're not a huge city, so a pretty good ratio of candy companies to people during the mid 20th century. So what companies are these? Not just chocolate, different kinds of candy. For example, Foxcross, maker of the Charleston Chews, and they are created in the 1920s and capitalize on the Charleston dance craze. I never really understood growing up what the chewy candies had to do with the Charleston, and it doesn't really have anything to do with it. They just kind of copped the name because it was popular. Daggett's Chocolates, Necco, New England Candy and Confectionery Company.
Can we just take a little pause there?
Yes.
And I want to see a thumbs up or a thumbs down from folks on Necco wafers, because I find them to be divisive, and I don't know why, because I give them oh no, Beth.
They are really good for making gingerbread house roofs. They're good tiles with your kids.
Well,
that's what they're good at, in my opinion. Oh, Marnie, look at you.
Thumbs up from Marnie. So anybody else has any opinions? I'd love to. Oh, we got some thumbs down. Oh, tough crowd. All right. Well, I think one thing, as I was telling my daughter this morning, tonight about this talk, we were thinking about the smells that came off of the various things being made in Cambridge. And of course, I think we can all understand. I see some thumbs up. I think we can all feel good about and reminisce about the smells of the candies being made.
Yes.
But of course, other smells came, which you'll talk about when
we will talk about that in the soap section for sure. And the last candy company I just wanted to also add was, speaking of good smells, Squirrel brand nuts and candy, and certainly the smell of the nuts in the Squirrel Nut zippers that we know the Revival swing band was named after. And we had Jimbo Mathis was a guest with us a couple of about a year and a half ago at our Shape by Cambridge event, which was great. And so there's this candy industry that really takes hold in Cambridge, and who is working there. And it's interesting when you look at the different demographic groups. It follows kind of a pattern that you see a lot in a lot of different industries. So the first wave is Brits and Germans. That's starting in the 1760s in Boston with the first candy companies that are started up. And so those are usually higher skilled workers that have made candy or done other similar work in their home countries and are coming here. And because the factory setup is not streamlined, each individual worker has to have a set of skills, a more complete set of skills to manufacture candy and other goods as well in other industries. So the earlier you are, the more diverse your skill set needs to be. As you move along to later periods and the production process gets streamlined and really what we think of as a pretty modern conveyor belt industrial system. You have fewer specific needs. You do your one task and that's it. You don't have to diversify your skill set. So it allows for a broader range of people to take on those jobs. So the second wave we see starting in the 1850s to 1880s are, of course, the Irish. And why are they coming at that time? Because of the potato famine starting in the 1840s and 1850s. And they are taking the place of Brits and Germans in large part in the candy industry and in many other industries across the country. Third wave, we have 1880s to all the way to the 1950s. That would be Italians, Portuguese, Lithuanians, other immigrants from Eastern and Southern European countries, and also Caribbean immigrants during this time, especially folks from Barbados. And the reason for this, in large part, is because the Barbados economy collapses in the end of the 19th century, and it's based almost entirely on sugar. So it's not diversified at all. Even Jamaica, also has a large sugar economy, but they also have rubber. And so when sugar fails, their economy doesn't go completely bust. But at one point, in the early part of the 20th century, there's an estimate that about half of Barbadian men leave the country to find work. And a lot of them start out on the Panama Canal, helping to build the Panama Canal, and they gravitate towards places like Boston and Cambridge and New England because something that I didn't realize and didn't think about until I started this research is that even though it seems very different from Barbados, they're both former British colonies and they have a sort of cultural, legal, and economic base in common. And so the systems that were in place in New England were very familiar to a lot of folks from Barbados. And then again, you see something with all of these groups as you move forward, which is that one kind of founding group comes and takes hold in an industry, in a particular industry. And then there's that tendency to write back to a place that you come from, to your family, to your friends, particularly if it's a place like, for example, Ireland in the mid 19th century where everyone is struggling and lots of folks are looking to get out and to improve their economic lot. You see a lot of conversation, a lot of letters going back and forth and saying, hey, this place is industrializing and they need more workers and I can get you a job. I can be your personal reference and you can come work with me, in the candy factory. I know you, I can vouch for you. Yes, Marika.
So would you say those folks felt welcome here when they came?
That is a great question. And I would say that more than likely they felt very welcome and embraced by their ethnic, religious, and or racial communities that were already established here. Not necessarily so welcome by other folks. There's a what they call the stepladder effect, which is when one group moves up the ladder towards these are words that I'm using in the context that they would have been thought of in the 19th and early 20th centuries: respectability, assimilation, Americanness, patriotism, things like that. Those are not words that I would choose personally at this point, but that was how it was viewed. So for instance, the Irish, in the 1840s and 50s and into the 60s, they are seen as hot-tempered, as lazy, as drunkards, as, prone to violence and lawlessness. But you get a generation or two born here, the Irish kind of move up the social ladder, the political and economic ladder, and who comes in? The Italians come in, and then the Irish, even the French Canadians come in, and those two groups share the Roman Catholic religion, which you might think they would say, oh, hey, we're both Catholic groups in a Protestant country. We should band together. We know what it's like to be outsiders. But no, you have the group like the Irish that takes that one step up on the ladder, and then the next group down, they kind of climb over their heads to get up to a more privileged position. So there's a lot of lack of solidarity that you might hope to see, but unfortunately doesn't always happen between groups. So but let's see, I think we talked about, so Barbadians and the collapse of the economy. Okay. So I'll pause there. Does anyone have any questions or comments about the candy industry? It really reaches its peak between the 1920s and the 1940s. And then, like so many of these industries, consolidation really takes over, and you get a few large companies, and with increases in transportation and mobility, you have fewer centers of production and fewer small companies and just large corporate conglomerates. Oh, thank you, Marika, for putting in our candy tour. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead then and move to, so William said that his maternal grandmother worked in Lever Brothers Soap from the 1930s onwards. She was a supervisor and mentioned union workers there. Okay, so excellent. So we'll move on to soap for our next industry. So soap is obviously something that you think of as, something that everybody needs. When you move away from household production, where the people that live within a household make everything that they need to survive as a family or as a household, and you move into factory production, everything, including these mundane domestic things like soap, need to be made in larger factory settings. And so we were definitely a big center for soap making. We had the first major company was John Reardon and Sons, and then of course Lever Brothers. Those are the two big ones. And again, when you talk about the groups of people that are working in these factories, it's the same overall overarching trajectory as with candy. So you have the English and the Irish in the 1850s to the 1870s. The second wave, French Canadians are big on that second wave in the soap factories, as they will be in the brickyards as well. Third wave, through the 1950s, you have Italians, Portuguese, other Southern and Eastern Europeans. You also have another group which we don't tend to talk about as much, which is internal migrants. African Americans coming from mostly the rural South during the Great Migration. The time frame for that overall, historians cap it at 1915 to 1970 is the Great Migration. So it's a big span, with most folks being concentrated in the 20s, 30s, and into the 40s. So there is the rise of Jim Crow laws, segregation, lack of economic opportunity, which drives a lot of Southern Blacks out of the South and to the North and to the West. And so the Cambridge area and its industries are definitely a lure for a lot of folks. And again, unfortunately, it's often a promised land that doesn't quite deliver on what folks are hoping to find when they get here. But you have this steady flow of people, and your aunt or your cousin might be here, and they might have a place for you to stay until you can get your own apartment. They can get you a job at Lever Brothers. Marion Darlington Hope, I don't know if anyone's familiar with her, great Cambridge figure, and she's done some tours for us, and she's done some oral histories, and she had a quote in one of them where she said that her family worked in the candy factory, but everyone on her street either worked in the candy factory or the soap factory. So everybody on her block had clean clothes and rotten teeth. So those were the two big ones. And she is of African descent. Her family is of African descent. So so you have folks moving within the United States. It's not just people coming from abroad and seeking better economic opportunities. You don't have legal segregation here. Especially in Cambridge, the schools are integrated starting in the late 1800s. And so a lot of folks, even moving over from Boston to Cambridge, just that quick jaunt across the river leads to families being able to put their children in desegregated schools. So that is definitely a draw. So, okay, let me go back to this. So Lever Brothers is a British company. They get their real boom starting in the 1890s, and the reason that soap making kind of takes off during that time is because there's a lot of companies that are making candles as well as soap, and candles are kind of their main industry, and they're using some of the remnants to make soap. And once you kind of phase out candles and gas lighting takes over, they start to make oil for gas lamps, but they also really start to produce soap as one of their main products, not just for washing bodies, bar soap, but powdered soap with the rise of the washing machine. So that's another big boon to the industry. So Lever Brothers, British company that gets into the American market in the 1890s. And so what's going on in these areas of Cambridge where this soap is being made? I'm going to ask if anyone has ever heard of the term Greasy Village. Has anyone ever heard of an area of Cambridge called Greasy Village? I had not heard of it. We have been talking about how it is a nickname, an old nickname for Cambridgeport that would make a great name for a beer. We would love to do a beer for a specialty brew for each neighborhood in Cambridge, and that would be the great one for Cambridgeport. And it's called Greasy Village. It was called Greasy Village because what do you make soap out of, and candles and oil and everything, but basically animal bones and the tallow that's in the bones. And so there's carts coming from butcher shops. Meat processing and meat packing is another industry in Cambridge, and so they're kind of partner trades in some ways. So the bones from the meat packing and butchering shops and factories are sold then to the soap makers, and as they're rounding the corners on these kind of rutted cart paths and early roads for automobiles, the bones and the pieces of animal remains spill out onto the street. And so it becomes very greasy on the streets and pretty bad smell, not like the Necco factory. So that's how they get the name Greasy Village. And apparently it was also very difficult, if anyone has ever unclogged a drain or done something else with lots of grease, it's really difficult to get it off of your skin and off your hair and everything. So it just kind of seeped in everywhere in Cambridgeport. Let's see.
Makes me feel bad about complaining I don't have AC in my office. People have
Exactly.
like the conditions, right? The conditions of working is.
Exactly. What did it and I think that's so powerful to kind of imagine not just what you did, but what it smelled like, what it looked like, what it felt like, the heat. We're not going to talk a lot tonight about the machine and machinery and iron and metal industries, but that certainly was another big Cambridge industry. And I'm thinking about the foundry and the ironworks. And there was a scandal in 1911 about a group of Polish women, Polish immigrant women who worked in the foundry. And they were so hot and so sweaty that they, stripped. They had these big, heavy aprons on that were covering them from getting sparks and, catching on fire. But they took off their blouses. They kind of stripped down underneath their aprons, and there was a big scandal about indecency and how can we make women do these horrible jobs, and isn't it a shame, isn't it endangering their womanhood and all of those things. And that's a really interesting story because it dovetails ideas about gender and protecting women, but these are also immigrant women. These are Central European women, which was a group that was not looked as highly on as other immigrant groups at the time, or folks who were born in Cambridge. So, and we should say, Marika, do you want to say a little bit about the Foundry play that's coming up in September, about that
Well,
story?
it's breaking news,
Yes.
but as everybody I'm sure knows, the Foundry is opening over in East Cambridge. It's very exciting. It's going to be a place for many activities, makerspace, art space, etc. But we've been invited. Beth is going to be a historical advisor to a play that's being written about this very story. So it's going to be performed live that weekend of September
10th and 11th.
10th and 11th. So come check it out. We're excited about it. It's thanks Talia for the link. It's such an interesting story, and like Beth says, I mean, there's just so many themes tied up in one single event. But isn't that history for you?
Absolutely. So I actually want to go off script for a minute because Jerry has made an excellent point, and I'd love to touch on it because it does have to do with some other things that I was planning on talking about in a little bit. So Jerry says, someone in Lowell once pointed out that the mill owners encouraged ethnic divisions by building Catholic churches and seeing to it that ethnic priests were placed in them. So the Irish settled in one area, the French Canadians in a second, and the Portuguese in a third. Then they assigned mill girls, so an English-speaking person sat next to one who spoke English and their partner spoke Portuguese. The result being workers had a hard time communicating with each other. So excellent points, and very true. So this pitting of ethnic groups against one another within a particular industry was not uncommon at all by owners and managers, and that was so that folks could not organize, could not unionize, could not collaborate and communicate effectively. And very similar, although the circumstances of their work were quite different, the methods used were very similar to enslavers who often preferred to have enslaved people taken from different parts of the African coast so that they could not communicate with one another. They didn't have a common language. So yes, there is a story too about, and I'm forgetting the name of the church, but I know that in North Cambridge, in the brickyards, in the communities around the brickyards, there was an Irish church, and when the French Canadians came, even though they were also Roman Catholic, the Irish would not let them join their church, and so they had to build a separate French Canadian church at the turn of the 20th century. So you do get this really siloed effect, and it was harder to organize if you had language in common. It was also, the fear was that if you could, especially for women, right? Women, quote unquote, love to chat with each other, and they're not going to get as much work done if they can talk to each other. But if they can't communicate, then they're going to just focus on their work. And that was the assumption by factory owners and managers as well. So So that brings us nicely into brick making, which is what North Cambridge is really most famous for as far as industries go. Um, there were lots of small companies to begin with, starting in the 1840s. And as happened with so many industries, they got consolidated. There was financial turmoil in the 1890s, and it went all the way through World War I. And it made it impossible for those small companies to survive. And so they most of them were bought out by the New England Brick Company, or NEBCO. And so by the early 20th century, most of those little plants have been consolidated under NEBCO. So we know that indigenous communities in and around Cambridge had long known about the clay pits in the area and had used them for small scale building projects, as well as for pottery. And during the 17th through the mid 19th centuries, the European colonists who came also used the local clay for these purposes. So again, they're using the clay pits but for a different scale and different purposes. And by 1858, around 187,000 bricks were being produced every day in North Cambridge. So almost 200,000 a day, which was huge.
You
And
can still see them in the sidewalks of Cambridge.
Yep, you absolutely can. They're still around. They're still wearing pretty well, many of them. So let's see. And again, you have the Irish dominate, and they dominate the brick industry so much that the area around the brickyards where many of the workers lived was known as Dublin or New Ireland. And although we kind of think of that as, kind of whimsical and nice today, it was not a compliment. It was seen as an insult. And we see that happening in various parts of Cambridge and many major cities where you have Chinatown or Little Italy or things like that. One thing that is really important to note, and we'll delve into this more at our next History Cafe in September, is that at this point in the 19th century and the early 20th century, folks are living very close to where they work, and often they're living in factory-owned housing or rooming houses that are large and are rented out. Rooms or small apartments are rented out to workers that all are in the same industry. So they're living close to where they work, and their community is really circumscribed in a good way, where they're all of their needs are sort of met in a small geographical area. And as things get more expensive and people are forced out, and the people who are working in a particular area of Cambridge can't afford to live there, then the demographics change. But at this point, the workers in the brickyards are living right down the street from where they're working. Okay. So we talked about the churches. That was the refusing to let the French Canadians into their churches. Let's see. Okay. So does anyone have any other questions or comments about bricks before we move on?
Beth, did you want to show your photo?
I do. I'm so sorry. I'm getting so excited talking about this. I forgot to show my photos. Hold on. Okay.
In our archives, we have the New England Brick Company collection. So that's just going to show. I'm going to share a link of more photos online to peruse at your leisure. But Beth's going to show some right now.
Okay. So here is it's thinking. There we go. So that is a worker. And if you look closely, hopefully it's big enough that you can see, that's a worker working on, that would not have even been all of the bricks that were produced in one day in the factory. And you can see them stacked up on the sides there. I thought those were buildings on the side with a little roof line. No, that's just a big stack of bricks there that are drying in the sun. So it's amazing. It's amazing to think about how much came out of the ground, and things like, you know, Jerry's pit that were left behind, right, and turned into a swimming hole because so much was taken out of the ground. So,
But don't swim there. It's not safe.
no, no, no. I'm gonna stop that share. I have a couple of other pictures to show of other industries, but that is my clay one. Just kind of gives you a sense of scale. And also just the fact that the worker is bent over, it just looks hot and literally backbreaking, that you're sort of physically uncomfortable and taxing. So
Beth, there's a question in the chat. Do we have brick sidewalks because of the industry?
that is a great question. And I don't know, but I'm going to guess yes. I'm going to guess that a lot of that nice industry money should, you know, folks wanted it to stay in Cambridge, because I'm sure that if Cambridge produces bricks in such volume, they can give the city a deal. And so why would the city choose cobblestones or other building materials when they can get a good deal at the local brickworks? So I will look that up and find out for sure, but I'm going to take an educated guess and say yes.
There's some people who love the brick sidewalks, and there are some people that do not.
It's true. It's true.
Divisive thing.
It's true. And I don't know that it's people don't like the bricks. It's people don't like that there's no more grout between the bricks. I think that's where the problem is, not the bricks themselves.
Well, I was told by a rabble-rousing board member that the bricks used to be not like set in concrete in the ground, so you could actually wedge them up in the 70s during protests and throw them. So that's no longer a thing. They're nailed down now.
Wow, I did not realize. So that is so interesting, and something that, you know, I'm sure there were some folks working in the brickyards who would have been thrilled to know that their handiwork was being used for protests, especially anti-capitalist protests, maybe, right? I think that's a great and interesting legacy. So, so I did want to just touch on a couple more things. I know that the tech industry definitely gets a lot of attention, and some of the other industries don't get as much love. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I do think it's worth noting that, you know, as the 20th century goes on and into the 21st century, you start to see changes in immigration law, and the types of people and the reasons that they're coming and the places that they're coming from start to shift. And I think that definitely has a good deal to do with the universities that are here in Cambridge, folks coming to study and then to stay. The Immigration Act of 1965 shifts who is welcome and who is encouraged to come. Previously, it was basically, can you make a living? Will you be an economic drain on your new city or your new country, or can you support yourself? Starting in 1965, it really changes to be preferential to people who have family connections already in the United States, and particularly in the area that they want to settle in, and also educational opportunities and people who are seeking higher education. And a lot of the sponsoring countries, like Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, so China and India, Pakistan, a lot of folks, those governments are hoping that they will send students to Harvard or MIT, and that they will come back. And oftentimes they do have to sign something that says that they will promise to come back and share their skills and their knowledge with their home country. But a lot of times people sign that before they come, and then they decide not to go back. So there are a lot of folks that come from Asian and Southeast Asian countries in particular to universities here and end up staying. And that talent and those efforts get siphoned pretty heavily into the tech industry. Certainly not entirely, but if we're talking about groups of immigrants that are coming and working in particular sectors, that would be the makeup of a lot of the tech sector. Biotech, medical innovation, all of these things. And that's, I think, something that we think of if we asked, what is Cambridge known for today? What industry is Cambridge known for in the present day? I think biotech in particular would be right up there. And that's due to changing immigration demographics and requirements and quotas that happened over the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st. But another sector that I don't think gets quite as much attention, but is really important and really flourishing, is the food and restaurant sector. And what you see happening is that when there are either crises, economic crises, wars, refugee situations, or other disruptions in people's home countries, a lot of times when they move to a new place like Cambridge, one of the simplest ways to kind of get their foot in the door is to open a restaurant or a food cart or some other kind of food service. Sometimes it's out of their home if they aren't able to get retail space right away. But sharing that aspect of your culture is something that you are familiar with as an immigrant, something that you can use to connect with people. I know that when we did our food tour of Central Square, the owner of Aleppo Palace, who is Syrian, of course, is quoted as saying, once you share a meal with someone, you can't ever be a stranger again. And so there's something very powerful and very intimate. And even though what have you got?
I didn't mean to interrupt. Beth.
No.
It was just that I wanted to do a little show and tell.
Oh yes, please do.
What you're saying is prompting in me. We recently had the event that you mentioned, and Stephen Chen talked about, his mother, Joyce Chen, and I was prompted to check out the children's book about Joyce Chen, and for my daughter, and she loves it. She loves dumplings. And we, in the book, it talks about Joyce Chen having to leave her country because of what was happening politically. And it just reminded me that somebody out of the blue sent me in the mail, sent History Cambridge, a Joyce Chen menu, which is pretty great. So that just came with all the wonderful that comes to it. And also, I don't know if anybody else knows about La Crepe. Did anybody go there?
No. Is it gone? Because I want to go. No, I don't even know what it is, but I heard crepes and I want to go.
No, it was 1274 Mass Ave in Harvard Square. And you could get, apparently the donor told me you could get a hamburger made out of horse meat.
Oh my.
So anyway, sharing one's culture through food.
Yes. And it really is a way when you talk to people of, say, British or Irish or Italian descent now, or in the second part of the 20th century, a lot of, like, my mom's family grew up in Cambridge, and they will say the first introduction I ever had to someone of a different culture was through eating at a restaurant. And so it is a way, when you have neighborhoods that are becoming ethnically siloed and divided, and there's racial tensions and there's a lot of other things going on, sharing somebody's culture through food is a very powerful and also, I think, safe entry point to sharing culture in that way. And so food, when we had that same program that Marika was talking about, we had Corky White talking about food and where you choose to eat and what types of food you choose to eat being a political decision for a lot of people, especially young people in the 50s and 60s and 70s in Cambridge. So for instance, there is an influx of Vietnamese refugees and Cambodian refugees during and after the Vietnam War. And it was considered a political act by especially young people, high school and college students, to travel to a different part of the city and to eat at a restaurant whose cultural food you had never had before. It was an act of solidarity. So that's a real bridge builder in that way. So yeah, and you see this happening. You see Vietnamese and Cambodians coming in the 1970s. You see Tibetans coming in the 1980s. You have Lebanese also in the 1980s, late 70s and 80s. We asked somebody, and I can't remember who said this, but we asked at our Central Square food tour last fall, we said, well, what do we think, what do folks think is next, sort of on the cutting edge? And somebody said Uyghur food was going to be next because the Uyghur political situation was gaining traction and gaining attention. And so that aspect of food culture and it kind of travels along with political and economic turmoil and situations in the rest of the world. The more we're aware of those, the more we seek out food as a means of solidarity. So yeah, so I see several people have said that the window shop in Harvard Square, that yes, they employed refugees from the Second World War, and that was definitely a really strong statement, I think, on their part, and a kind of vouching for those people, and in a way that, you know, you see this in many different situations in the First and the Second World War as well. You see workers, for instance, in both the First and Second World War, workers of German heritage, especially first generation German Americans, and also Italian Americans, Japanese Americans. You see that they are both more highly suspect because of their ethnic origins, and also more likely to engage in certain kinds of industry, like munitions, like war work, whatever it is that's industrial production that gets sort of channeled towards the war. That is seen as an act of patriotism, and it's a way that they can say, hey, I may have been born in Japan, or my parents may have been born in Japan or Germany or wherever, but I'm an American, and I'm going to contribute to the war effort through this industrial production, and I'm going to show, you know, how loyal I am. There's an interesting story that I came across from the Carter's Ink Company. They made writing kits for soldiers, and they would, sometimes women would do this in particular. They would kind of roll up little messages and put them in there for the soldiers to unravel when they got overseas. But there were also people that did that from various ethnic groups and said, you know, I'm a German and I support you. I'm a German American and I support the war effort. So those little ways that you might not think would be touchstones for individuals to cross those boundaries, for sure.
Beth, this has been wonderful, and I'm just being mindful of the time. If anybody has any questions, pop them in the chat. And while you're thinking about that, I guess I'm just going to ask you some technical questions. Where were you finding all this information that you've been researching?
So I will say, not to toot our own horn, because this was before my time at History Cambridge, but History Cambridge has a lot of great resources. So I would strongly suggest, if folks want to know more about this, to kind of tool around on our website. We are we're unveiling a new version of our website soon, so it'll be even easier to research. But we do have a lot of self-guided tours and a lot of blog posts and research extras that have to do with industry and immigration. I will send some of the major tours and resources that I used. I'll send them tomorrow, along with the link to the survey, which I hope you all will take a minute to fill out, but I'll send some links if you want to go exploring further. Also, the Cambridge Public Library has digitized local newspapers from the 1840s through the present, and you can search by keyword, and there is some fascinating stuff in there, and you can see it in, in its original form. You can see advertisements for industrial work. You can see articles about Cambridge being a center of production. You can see things about different immigrant groups coming at different times, and their effect on Cambridge industry. So there's a lot out there. My actual difficulty, as Marika knows well, is cutting down and not just going kind of whole hog. There was a lot to look at and a lot to interpret. So.
Well, I guess my closing question to you, Beth, is what haven't you researched that you want to learn more about?
That is a great question. So I actually would love to learn more about groups that are coming in from different parts of the country, not just African Americans, but folks who are migrating from the South, from the West, and seeking new economic opportunities. Maybe they're second or third generation, and their grandparents were immigrants. But internal migration is also really interesting to me because we tend to think of the United States as being, culture being pretty standard across the country in many ways, and being able to see and access what people's experiences are in different parts of the United States. But when you're traveling from, say, California to Cambridge in the 1930s, it's a really different experience. And I would love to know what motivated people to move, not just from other countries, but from other parts of the United States, and what their expectations were and what they found when they got here, whether those two things lined up.
Well, that sounds like a great place to end it. The moral of that story is write your memoirs, everybody. Everybody
Yes.
wants to know your experience.
Yes, please.
So, wow. Thanks, Beth. This has been really enjoyable. I love
been wonderful.
nerding out with you all the time, but I'm glad other folks got to sit in. It's just the average day at History Cambridge over here talking about these kinds of things. But so thanks again to Beth. Hooray.
Thank you.
And if you, everyone will get an email tomorrow from Beth with links, as she mentioned. We also have a survey. We might drop the link here in case you want to take it immediately. That would be great. We read every single answer and we take them very seriously. So thanks in advance for doing that. There's the link. I want to again thank you to our sponsor, Mass Humanities, for their amazing work supporting this and work across the Commonwealth. Couldn't do this without them. And we take August off officially. I mean, behind the scenes, we still come to the office, but we go quiet a little bit in August. But come September, Beth mentioned we have a history cafe on the way. It's going to be amazing and in person. So we hope you can join us for that. And we're going to have a guided tour as well down in Cambridgeport. And that's going to be really interesting. Good excuse to get out there, see things and ask questions as we stumble upon them together. So I hope everyone has a great night. Thank you for your support. It means a lot to us and we love having these conversations with you. If there's anything that we can do for you, history related, give us a call. We're here for you. Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks so much, all. Take care.